Hello there, and welcome to this gently unfolding tale from the cold and creaking world of medieval Europe. Tonight, or today depending on when you are listening, we will wander together through the smoky dwellings, drafty barns and frost-laden fields of peasant life, moving slowly and carefully as we trace the delicate details of how ordinary people survived the merciless winters that pressed down upon them centuries ago. If your eyes are heavy, let them be. This story has no urgency, no rush, just the steady pace of life as it once was, and a chance for you to drift softly into rest as history whispers its secrets. Imagine for a moment that you are there. The year is perhaps 1270. The calendar has turned to December, and the sun barely musters the strength to rise in the mornings. In a small village nestled beneath the shadow of a castle, smoke curls skyward from low, timber-framed cottages that cluster together like huddled sheep. The chill is unrelenting, seeping through every crack in the thatch and every gap in the wooden door. Inside those cottages are the peasants, the backbone of the medieval world, who must endure the dark and freezing days of winter, surviving on their resourcefulness, their communal bonds, and sometimes sheer stubborn patience. The cottage in which we will focus our attention tonight is simple to the point of poverty. The walls are wattle and daub, a lattice of sticks plastered with mud, dung, and straw. The floor is little more than packed earth, colder than stone and unforgiving to bare feet. In the centre smoulders the hearth fire, a rough opening without chimney, the smoke curling upward to escape through a hole in the roof or gaps in the walls. This fire is not merely for warmth, but is the very heart of survival. It cooks, it lights, it dries clothing, and above all, it keeps the family from freezing as the bitter winds claw at the dwelling. A peasant family in winter lived and slept together in close quarters. Straw pallets stuffed into cloth sacks, skins of sheep or goat, and if luck allowed, heavy wool blankets served as their beds. More often than not, parents and children pressed tightly together on such bedding, sharing body heat because no single blanket could suffice. At times, even the animals were brought in for warmth, chickens in baskets, goats tied near the door, and perhaps if the family had one, a cow in the corner of the one-room house. Their breath clouded the air, their bodies adding degrees to the temperature, and the blending of species beneath one roof was accepted as practical necessity rather than inconvenience. Clothing became a second layer of bedding. Rather than pajamas, peasants slept in the same tunics and woolen hose they had worn through the day, sometimes with cloaks pulled tightly about them. Outer garments could be spread upon the sleeping pile as extra covers. Small children often crept between their parents where the warmth was most secure, while elders wrapped their heads in linen coifs or woolen caps, for a great deal of precious warmth slips away through the scalp if left uncovered. But warmth through the nights was only part of the challenge. The fire intended to endure dusk until dawn was fickle. Without coal, and with scarcely enough good timber, peasants relied mostly on coppiced wood, kindling, dried turf, or in regions where land was poor, bundles of peat and even dried dung. A husband might spend much of the day cutting shrubs or gathering sticks, while a wife shaped dried dung cakes stored near the hearth. The trick was to bank the fire carefully before bed, rearranging the embers and covering them with ash so they would smoulder slowly through the night. If successful, the faint glow could be coaxed back into flame come morning. If not, someone had to rise before first light and trudge cold-fingered outside to gather frost-laden twigs and start the process anew in darkness. Sometimes, in particularly poor households, fuel ran low well before winter ended. Then survival became a true trial. Blankets were doubled and tripled, straw bedding replenished, and work shifted to daylight hours alone to conserve what little firewood remained. In deeper rural districts, neighbours might band together in what could be called fire sharing. If one house could not hold embers, a neighbour might send a glowing stick wrapped in moss to restart their hearth. Fire in this age was life, and to be without it was dangerous indeed. As much as we may imagine medieval peasants as endlessly downtrodden, their communities possessed quiet ingenuity. To preserve warmth, not only did they rely on thick wool and fur, but they engineered their humble homes for insulation as best they could. Thatched roofs, though drafty, provided layers of straw that trapped air, creating a modest barrier against the cold. Wattle walls smeared with additional mud could be patched anew before winter to seal cracks. Small windows were shuttered tightly, and the very small size of cottages meant fewer cubic feet to heat compared to the stone mansions of noblemen, where a dozen roaring fires still left rooms frosty. For the peasant, huddling together in one smoky chamber might have looked humble, but in winter it was sensible and survivable. Diet also played its part in enduring the cold. By December, the autumn harvest was already stored away in barns and huts. Root vegetables like turnips, parsnips, onions, and leeks were preserved to carry families through the barren season. Barley and oats, stored as grain, could be ground into coarse flour for bread or boiled into stews thick enough to coat the stomach and provide lasting warmth. Some peasants cured salted pork, others dried fish, and cabbage stored in earthen pits became a staple dish, served boiled and plain, but hearty. In times when food ran thin, watery pottage simmered in the pot over the fire became the standard fare, a mix of whatever was at hand, endlessly reused day after day. Yet even these modest stews were warming and filling enough to push back against the sharp bite of winter's hunger. The coldest nights were rarely faced without preparation. Men and women took time during the daylight to mend gaps in doors, fix holes in roofs, and bolster the firewood pile. Autumn's work was always done with winter in mind. Animals slaughtered, meat smoked, fruit dried, and ale brewed in large barrels to sit patiently until needed. A warm drink of ale, mulled with spices if one had access, was itself a small heater of the body. And while clean water was available often only through wells, warmed ale or thin beer was safer to drink and lent a comfort that pure water could not provide. Of course, peasants could not halt their labour in winter altogether. Even in icy mornings, shepherds trudged out wrapped in cloaks to tend to sheep, whose fleece was critical for spinning warm cloth. Women pressed together in halls to spin, weave, and mend garments, for clothing wore out quickly when used to both sleep and work in. Children gathered what sticks or brambles they could find, sometimes even stripping dead hedges with small knives. Daily survival through December, January, and February was a careful economy of labour, calories, and warmth. Underneath this rugged routine, there lay the communal rhythm of medieval life. Villagers helped each other withstand the worst weeks. Feasts tied to Christmas or Candlemas broke up the monotony of dull grey days. A whole ham roasted on a holy day could feed dozens, filling bellies and hearts for a time. And neighbours might carry extra broth to the sick, since one less working pair of hands in winter could spell disaster for the whole family. Peasants' strategies for enduring cold nights were not written down in splendid chronicles, because the educated scribes preferred to record battles and noble lineages. Instead, their survival was an uncelebrated rhythm of ordinary life, passed from parent to child, shaped by necessity. To lie under scratchy wool, pressed between kin, the air thick with smoke from a banked fire, while frost traced patterns down the inside of the wall. That was normality, and so long as each dawn arrived with embers still glowing, the system had worked, and another day was granted. Now, with this picture, let us slowly journey through that wintry medieval world one layer deeper, exploring how the body, spirit, and community together sustained the peasants who lived through the season of ice and shadow. As the long night fades and the faint light of morning stretches itself across a frost-silvered village, the peasant household stirs back to life with the embers of the hearth. There is no indulgent rising late, no lazy hours to waste while cold presses insistently against the walls. Work begins as soon as visibility allows. Before the fire is even coaxed back into flame, a woman might already be at the pot, breaking apart yesterday's crust of barley bread and dropping it into warm water or thin ale to create a thick slurry for breakfast. It is not glamorous, but it is fuel for the body. And in this frigid season, that alone is treasure enough. Children are tasked with small jobs to prepare for the day. One son takes ashes out of the hearth and scatters them outside, sometimes to thaw icy patches where animals pass. Another gathers chips of wood or bramble sticks kept in piles near the dwelling. Younger girls brush straw bedding smooth, shake out the cloaks, and chase chickens back to their baskets. Life is measured in dozens of tiny, necessary acts that would seem tedious until one understands that each contributes to survival. In winter, nothing is trivial when it aids warmth, food, or safety. The men of the family shoulder heavier tasks. Some trudge to the woodlands to gather fallen branches. Others repair fences that the wind has shaken, for livestock must be kept safe from wolves and roving dogs that become bold in hunger during the colder months. In some regions of Europe, wolves truly were a peril. Stories persisted through village folklore about packs prowling beneath the moon, seized by desperation and daring enough to enter settlements. Whether these tales were exaggerated or not, they kept peasants vigilant. Fire kept near barns, gates barred tight each evening, and weapons, crude pikes or axes propped near the door. The proximity to animals during winter was both a shield and a test of patience. The warmth they provided was invaluable, but the smell and noise of cohabiting with goats, sheep and cows turned cottages into barns. A traveller stepping into such a house might recoil at the mixture of smoke, sweat and manure. But for the peasant, this was the scent of warmth and survival. The alternative, separating beasts entirely from humans during freezing nights, could mean both livestock perishing and humans enduring colder air. In survival, compromise outweighed comfort. One of the persistent challenges on the coldest days was water. Streams froze over, wells iced above their rims, and snow had to be melted over the hearth for cooking and washing. Since wood or peat was precious, the family used water sparingly, prioritizing cooking and drinking over cleanliness. Bathing in the way we think of it today was rare, not only because of custom, but because of pure impracticality. In the heart of January, to shed clothes and pour water over one's skin in a stone basin with the wind blowing through cracks in the hut could do more harm than good. Instead, peasants relied on small cloths warmed near the fire, washing hands, faces, and feet quickly before retreating back beneath cloaks. Clothing, thin as it may have been, was layered with care. Wool was the main defense against chill. Even the poorest families endeavored to spin their own, patching garments tirelessly. Hose covered legs, tunics wrapped the torso, and cloaks protected shoulders. Mittens or gloves were rough but practical. Hats were considered near mandatory in cold months, whether a coif of linen worn beneath a heavier woolen cap, or in northern regions, fur caps to offer greater comfort. Clothing was sometimes stiff with age and dirt in winter, because washing was so seldom possible, but so long as it trapped warm air, it sufficed. Through their endurance, peasants developed rhythms that aligned with the sun itself. Daylight was brief, the middle of winter offering no more than 8 or 9 usable hours. In this time, all critical tasks had to be completed. Firewood gathered and chopped, livestock checked, grain measured out carefully for both family and animal feed, and any possible repairs made to hut, cart or tool, since to delay meant risking structural collapse under snow or death of livestock through hunger. This ceaseless cycle was accepted. Complaints were spoken, but seldom believed to carry much point, because in a world governed by cycles of season, everyone knew the cold was neither a surprise nor a visitor that could be dismissed. Village life in winter was communal, not only by necessity, but by instinct. Neighbours often shared chores for things too heavy or dangerous for one family alone. A great timber might need 3 or 4 men to drag it from a woodland. A sick ox was tended by several households together, since the animal might plough all their fields come spring. The bonds of reliance knitted villages tightly, perhaps more so in harsh months than at any other time of year. When darkness settled and work was impossible, stories and songs filled the silence. A shared cup of ale, a ballad about saints or about ancient kings, or a tale about a ghostly figure wandering the snowy moor. All united spirits, warmed hearts beyond what fire alone could manage. The church bell also marked time in the village. Winter was liturgical as much as it was practical. From Advent to Christmas, then through Epiphany, villagers looked toward the holy calendar as a guide. Feasts punctuated the monotony. Candlemas early in February marked not only a sacred ritual with candles representing light and hope, but also reminded peasants that the darkest, most perilous days were beginning to ease. Religious ritual was inextricably bound with survival itself, for it gave meaning to the sufferings endured. A brutal hailstorm was punishment to some. A long thaw was seen as holy blessing. Inside the family home come evening, the task was simple. Conserve every ounce of warmth. Families huddled together again, adding straw to bedding, adjusting the fire carefully, telling stories to distract children from hunger or chill. Games might be played with knucklebones of sheep or simple carved boards, but always near enough to the fire's glow to stretch its heat as far as possible. If luck was kind, dried fruit or honey left over from autumn gave sweetness to the night. If not, bread dipped in ale was the dessert, modest but filling. These details may sound repetitive when taken as isolated memories, yet to someone living it day after day, the rhythm became a tapestry by which each thread mattered, each ember tended, each cloak stitched, each goat brought indoors contributed to a sum greater than its part. Where nobles commanded fortresses and castles, peasants guarded embers, scraps of wool, roots, and one another. And it is remarkable in its quiet way that through centuries, Despite the ice, wind, and hunger of countless winters, generations of common villagers survived, even flourished in their own measure, preserving knowledge of endurance we can still trace today. As sleep draws nearer in our own time, picture yourself closing your eyes by the flickering firelight of their world. Hear the wood pop in the hearth, feel the wool scratch across your shins, and know that for all the hardships they endured, the peasants of medieval Europe survived their long freezing nights by gathering together, by working diligently, and by respecting the rhythm of the cold season. From here, let us wander more deeply into the textures of how the cold shaped not only their nights, but their minds, their folklore, their fears, and their hopes. As the deep winter wraps its icy fingers around the medieval landscape, the peasants' struggle against cold grows into something more than just physical survival. It enters their imagination, their stories, their fears, and even their beliefs about the unseen world. Winter was not only a season of frosted earth and numb fingers, but a time when the villagers' minds wove explanations and comforts into the bleakness of their environment. When darkness fell early and lingered late, people told tales that gave meaning to the endless night. The half-sleeping children pressed against their parents would whisper about ghosts walking the frosty lanes, or spirits blowing through cracks in the walls with the shrieking wind. Some believed the wild hunt passed overhead in the storm clouds, a cavalcade of ghostly horsemen led by a spectral figure, sweeping through the sky with hounds baying and torches blazing. To witness it was to risk being carried away. Whether anyone ever truly believed they saw it was secondary. The story was enough to make the wind's howls seem like more than mere gusts. The church played its role in shaping how people interpreted the cold. The misery of bitter weather was presented as a test of faith, a reminder of Adam and Eve's fall, a season where patience mirrored the patience of the saints. Priests encouraged villagers to see their suffering as temporary, to be rewarded in the next life. The lighting of candles at certain saints' days reassured them that light itself was holy, that warmth awaited when darkness had finally run its course. Hope became as valuable as firewood. At the same time, old folk remedies circulated alongside church sermons. Housewives kept cabinets, or more often little wooden chests, of herbs dried from summer. Sage, thyme, rosemary, which when boiled in hot broth provided not only some flavour, but also supposed protection against coughs. Garlic was a favourite, thought to drive away both illness and malevolent spirits of the cold. Honey mixed into heated ale soothed throats roughened by smoke and frost. Smelling herbs burned over the fire refreshed foul air inside close huts. These little measures may not always have worked in truth, but they gave confidence to families facing long wintry nights where sickness always threatened. Illness was indeed a constant danger. Smoke from the fire had no chimney to escape, so it lingered inside huts, coating the lungs. Children often coughed through the season, and elders weakened. Infections spread easily when households huddled so close. There were no doctors affordable for peasants. Instead, they relied on wisdom passed down, sometimes effective, sometimes not. To ward off chill, people tied charms of iron or simple crosses over beds, mingling practical warmth with symbolic defense. They feared not only the fever and chill of bodies, but the invisible touch of forces they could not name. Winter also transformed work habits. With daylight fleeting and fields hard and frozen, sowing and ploughing halted. Instead, households turned to crafts better suited to confined spaces. Women spun wool with drop spindles, winding it into thread. Children fingered rushes into simple rope or mats. Men carved handles for tools, mended harnesses and patched shoes. These were quiet labours, requiring minimal light from a tallow lamp or even only the fire's glow. They kept hands busy and minds steady through the monotony of weeks spent indoors. The fruits of this labour, newly mended cloaks, thicker cloth, tighter shoes, would in turn protect against the cold when the family ventured out. On the very worst nights, when great storms rolled across Europe, huts creaked under drifts of snow, and wind rattled shutters until sleep was near impossible. Families waited in silence as white powder blew in through cracks, sprinkling floors and making straw bedding damp. This was when survival leaned hardest on endurance of spirit. They whispered prayers, clutched one another tighter, and willed dawn to come quickly, hoping to see their fences still standing and their animals still alive. Despite this, not every night was grim. Some evenings were warmed by cheer. Villagers sometimes gathered in the largest hut of the settlement, where a slightly bigger hearth gave space to host neighbours. The sharing of food and the exchange of news lifted morale. During Christmastide, for example, villages came alive with carols and simple pageants. Allar casks were tapped, and if a family had butchered a pig in November, dried sausages or strips of bacon could be brought forth and shared in December feasts. Laughter and storytelling echoed, blunting the sharp teeth of winter, if only for a short while. The natural world beyond those huts still had to be faced each day. Peasants walked upon frozen earth, their worn shoes stuffed with straw for insulation, crackling with each step. Snowdrifts muffled the sounds of the village, turning every lane and hedge into a quiet otherworld. The countryside, normally noisy with birds and beasts, fell into stillness, broken only by the caw of crows or the bark of a dog. Nights were darker, yet they glittered with stars sharper than those seen in warmer seasons. For peasants, inexperienced with any world beyond their own, this empty brilliance in the heavens must have seemed unearthly, a constant, silent reminder of both danger and beauty. In those brief hours of twilight between day and night, a sense of magic often crept in. Young men returning from chopping wood told stories of lights glowing faint on distant ridges, the ghostly lanterns of souls, or so they said. Children dared each other to step out into the snow at night and listen for voices in the wind. The long cold carved itself into imagination as much as into bone. And through these imaginings, peasants gave themselves something to hold on to, a sense that the cold nights were not devoid of meaning but full of mysteries that bound them to the land and heavens. Morning, when it finally came again, was not always gentle. Frost on door hinges bit steel hard. The animals groaned and stamped, demanding release and forage. Water drawn from a well had to be cracked with iron to scoop it. But each morning survived brought renewed rhythm, renewed opportunity to do all the small things, feeding, mending, tending, conserving, that made survival possible. It was an exhausting steadiness, yet one undertaken with no illusion. For the medieval peasant, to live at all meant to endure. And as we continue our slow walk through their winter lives, we turn next toward their relationship with food and drink in the dead season. For what they could store, brew, or preserve often meant the difference between steady survival and quiet tragedy beneath the snow. As the frozen ground holds the fields in its grip, food becomes more precious than gold in the life of a medieval peasant. The soil, usually the sustenance of their existence, is locked beneath frost, refusing to yield even a single green shoot. For months, the diet transforms into a careful dance of rationing and stretching whatever could be stored, salted, smoked, or dried. The peasant lived not with a supermarket, but with what they and their neighbours managed to keep alive from the last harvest. Each meal was more than nourishment. It was a calculated measure of how long the household might hold out before spring. The most central food of all was bread. Grain, whether barley, rye, oats, or if very lucky, wheat, was ground into coarse flour at the Lord's mill. Every village depended on such grinding stones, for flour was the basis of sustenance. Bread filled bellies even if it was sometimes dark, dense, and so tough it could strain one's teeth. In winter, bread was eaten in thin slices stretched out to last longer, or dropped into broth to soften it. Peasants did not expect the white loaves enjoyed by nobility. Instead, they lived on the heavy loaves of mixed grain, sometimes cut with ground peas or beans to eke out supply. Each bite was practical fuel, packed into rough crusts that could be stored for days or even weeks when hardened. But bread alone was hardly sustaining during months of labour in the cold. Stew, or pottage, was the constant companion of bread. Into a large pot suspended over the hearth went whatever could be spared. Root vegetables like turnips and parsnips, dried peas or beans, cabbage leaves if any survived the storage pit, and precious scraps of meat or fat. The pot often simmered for days, with each new addition folded into the broth that had deepened in flavour. One could say the pot never truly emptied, only replenished. Every family's pottage tasted different, yet for those who lived it, it was the defining flavour of survival in winter. Meat was rare, but hardly absent. Each autumn, animals were slaughtered before winter set in, since keeping too many mouths fed through barren months was impossible. Sausages were dried above the hearth, bacon salted and hung, and in luckier households, ham smoked for months of keeping. These were savoured in tiny portions, never devoured in large feasts unless it was mid-winter festival. A small bone could flavour a pot for weeks. Even dripping fat saved from cooking was a prized ingredient to spread on bread for an extra spark of calories. Peasants valued every crumb of animal produce, for little went to waste when the night winds gnawed at one's strength. Fish added another pillar to the winter diet. especially in regions near rivers or coasts. Dried herring, salted cod, and even eels provided essential variety to monotonous meals. The Church's frequent prohibitions on eating meat during fasts made fish doubly valuable. Families salted large hauls in autumn, so they could be drawn upon during fast days of December and January. To sit by the fire with dried fish simmering in pottage, its salty tang softening into the broth, was a modest but reliable comfort. To drink, beer and ale were staples. Thin, lightly brewed ale was safer than drinking stagnant water, which could spread illness. Brewing ale was a constant cycle. Households or communal brewers made new batches regularly, as barrels emptied quickly when both family members and guests dipped their cups. In winter, warmed ale was a source of not only calories but morale. For children, a weaker form called small beer was common. It was frothy, nourishing, and contained little alcohol, enough to hydrate without causing drunkenness. For peasants without great stores of grain, ale brewing had to be carefully rationed. But even a little was considered a blessing at supper. One of the least considered but most important winter foods was dairy. Milk itself spoiled quickly, but its products endured. Butter salted to preserve, cheese aged in cool cellars. These became protein-rich supplements on cold days. Small wheels of cheese stored in cloth could last months if carefully tended. A sliver of sharp cheese with bread and onion was often the peasant's equivalent of a delicacy. Sweetness was a rarity. Honey, if available, was prized both for flavour and medicine. It could be drizzled sparingly into ale or pottage. Dried fruit like apples or figs were sometimes found in peasant households, though more typical of better-off families or as gifts on feast days. For most, fruit in winter was stored as shriveled apples that might wrinkle, but still carried the memory of summer sun. If a family had an orchard, cider could be brewed, offering not only drink but a little bright taste against the monotony of bread and cabbage. Preservation carried its own rituals. Root vegetables were buried in cellars or heaped under straw mounds outside, insulated from frost. Cabbage heads might be kept in pits dug into the earth, covered thickly to prevent rot. Animal fat, skimmed off broth, was stored in pots and served later in cooking. Salt itself was one of the most valuable resources of survival. Where salt was scarce, people smoked meats or fish instead, blackening them over slow fires until they hardened. These would then be softened in stews as the weeks went by. Each method of preservation was a hedge against hunger, a line of defense drawn against the inevitability of long, empty months when the soil lay dead. To manage food stores was an act of discipline. A greedy feast in January could mean famine in February. Households measured out portions carefully, sometimes weighing bread against the number of mouths in the family. Neighbors policed one another with advice and warnings, for a reckless family endangered not just itself, but the village, since their hunger could spill into need for charity from others. Winter was a proving ground of prudence, teaching patience to every generation. On festival days, however, restraint was suspended, if only briefly. A roast pig at Christmas, shared by the community, could draw laughter into smoky halls, and men with flushed faces from strong ale might briefly forget there were weeks of hunger ahead. Music from a fiddle or simple pipe carried across the snow, mixing with the scent of roasting meat, giving peasants joy enough to warm them until the next morning's bitter chill brought them back into the rhythm of careful rationing. Food, drink, and the habits of preserving them were more than mere sustenance. They symbolized endurance, faith, and resourcefulness. To hold a candle in midwinter was hope, but to bite into bread and stew was survival made tangible. Returning each evening to a hut where the pottage simmered, steady meant families could believe, just for a while, that warmth and sustenance stretched far enough into the uncertain weeks ahead. As we move further in their story, let us step into the realm of labour, the daily effort that never fully ceased even in the depths of cold, ploughing, cutting, fetching and weaving, all reshaped and slowed by the pressing freeze of winter's rain. Though the ground outside lay stiff with frost and the crops were long harvested, the work for medieval peasants never truly ceased. Winter was a slower season, yes, but not one of idleness. The body needed constant motion to stave off the sting of cold, and the village itself relied on endless chores that could not wait for spring. Each day brought tasks that, though quieter than harvest or planting, were vital to holding life together through the barren months. Inside the smoky cottages, much of the work shifted toward maintenance and craft. Wool spinning became a focus, with women sitting by the sparse light of fire or tallow lamp, twisting fibres from sheep into thread. The whir of the drop spindle and the soft rustle of wool were common winter sounds in any peasant hut. With yarn finally produced, it was woven into cloth, sometimes on simple upright looms, more often passed to weavers who specialized in the craft. Clothing patches were made constantly. For winter, shredded garments quickly. Knees and elbows wore thin, shoes split, and cloaks frayed at the hem. To keep out the cold, every stitch mattered. Shoes in particular needed special care in the winter months. Simple leather boots were lined with straw to hold in what little heat could be trapped. But leather that once wet turned stiff as boards when frozen, so work went into greasing and softening them. Children often went barefoot indoors to conserve footwear, saving boots only for necessary chores outside. A single good pair of boots could make the difference between withstanding the winter and succumbing to frostbite during endless trudges across snow. Men tackled heavier tasks. Hedgerows still had to be mended, even in frozen soil. Wooden handles for hoes, axes, and ploughs were carved during these months. Hunting snares were repaired and set, though game was scarce when snow covered the ground. Nets for fishing were knotted quietly by the fire. Logs from collected wood were split into kindling. In times when wind cracked roofs or snow weighed down thatch, repairs had to be made by climbing into the biting air, for any leak could mean misery inside. And while the land was largely dormant, animals provided their own endless cycle of care. Cows and sheep needed fodder, stored hay measured carefully to last the season. Goats picked at whatever could be spared, and poultry were kept close to the hearth for warmth and eggs, though hens laid fewer when the days grew short. Every animal was considered not only for its current yield, but also its potential for spring breeding. Losing a hen to frost or a lamb to malnutrition meant consequences far beyond a single meal. It could ripple into next year's food supply, so peasants carried out their feeding, mucking and nursing even in blizzards, shoulders hunched beneath cloaks, boots sinking into snowdrifts, determined not to let their small family herds perish. This constant tending was exhausting but also grounding. The repetition created stability in the midst of the unpredictability of weather. With frost covering the windowsills and the dull hush of snowfall pressing the world silent, the routine of feeding, mending, spinning, and chopping gave rhythm to each day. In some sense, the work was survival itself, as much mental as physical, for it reminded villagers they retained some control in a world so frequently at the mercy of nature. Not all labour was practical repair. Winter was also the season for communal obligations. Lords often demanded corvée labour, services even in winter for upkeep of roads, hauling timber, or manning estate duties. A peasant could be called away from his fragile household to serve the manor, trudging over iced roads to chop firewood for the lord's hall, or carry supplies to neighbouring towns. The weight of obligation grew no lighter just because frost sealed the earth. For the smallest children, winter was when they learned by watching. Too small to plough or reap wheat, they helped with chores appropriate to their size, carrying buckets of water, gathering kindling, stirring the pot with wooden spoons. Small lessons in thrift and care were taught as naturally as breathing. Don't waste the grain, wrap the cloaks tightly, mind the fire embers. In this way, winter was a silent teacher, instructing generation after generation in patience and endurance. By evening, when all possible work was done, families turned once more to each other and the hearth. Leisure was not absent, though it was modest. A simple board game carved of wood, or a string of riddles spoken between relatives, might serve as entertainment. Songs were recited, religious chants reminding them of angels, or ballads about kings, translated down into rustic verses. Music, even if just a pipe carved from elderwood or a fiddle scraped roughly with a bow, could fill an evening with sound warmer than flame. These gatherings stitched families together and kept spirits alive through the length of winter's trial. In all these duties, both humble and heavy, medieval peasants found themselves bound tightly, not just to their own survival, but to the delicate balance of the village. If one family neglected their work, livestock could perish, fences collapse, and contagion spread. Each person's effort dovetailed into the whole, creating a communal net that caught all within it. Winter tested that net mercilessly, tugging at its strands, and those who lived to greet spring had proved that the weaving still held. And yet, in this same cold season, amidst relentless work and bare meals, peasants found space for belief, ritual, and a kind of sacred rhythm. Their endurance was not merely practical, it was spiritual, woven into their prayers, their festivals, and their hopes for rebirth come spring. Let us turn now to how faith and community rituals lit small fires of meaning in the long, frozen dark. Faith was as necessary to surviving the frozen months as firewood or food. For the medieval peasant, winter was not endured through body alone, but through the conviction that there was order, purpose, and light hidden within the darkness. The church bells that tolled over snow-laden fields served as both compass and comfort, structuring days and reminding villagers that their struggles were watched by heaven. When nights stretched endlessly, belief filled the gaps that no cloak or roof could shield. Advent began the winter season with a sense of waiting, both for Christmas and for rebirth beyond cold's dominion. Even in the poorest huts, villagers fashioned wreaths of evergreen branches, symbols that life persisted even in deep frost. Christmas itself was the rare moment when famine's tight grip briefly loosened. Families prepared the best of their stores, reserved pork salted months earlier, special loaves baked with spices if they could be bartered, and sometimes a goose or chicken fattened through autumn. Neighbours gathered in one another's cottages, fireplaces burning brighter than on ordinary days, voices raised in carols that cut through smoke and frost. For one evening, laughter warmed spaces where breath usually clouded like mist. Yet even beyond Christmas, festivals provided small beacons. The Feast of Epiphany, then Candlemas in February, carried meanings beyond ritual. They were signals that winter's long dominion was bending, that days truly were lengthening, that seedtime was not impossibly far. Candlemas in particular, with its blessing of candles, was felt not just as symbolism but as promise, the flame a reminder of growing light both literal and spiritual. These rituals carried psychological strength, but they were also communal anchors. A shared feast meant shared burden. If a family had struggled with thin supplies, the charity and solidarity of neighbours could keep them from collapse. Winter reminded everyone that no one survived alone, that cooperation and goodwill were strongest when frost tested livelihoods most severely. Bread shared now might be repaid in hay shared later, or labour traded when spring ploughing began. Thus, faith and pragmatism blended until generosity itself was part of surviving the coldest months. Folklore threaded itself through these celebrations, giving warmth to the imagination. Children were told stories of saints walking invisibly among cottages on snowy nights, leaving favours or punishments depending on behaviour. Old tales of household spirits, either helpful or mischievous, explained why fires reignited easily one morning and stubbornly refused the next. Even winter animals, the fox slipping through drifts, the owl hooting at midnight, became woven into superstitions that coloured the long nights with mystery rather than bleakness. By the time March pressed its dull, soggy thaw against the fields, peasants felt both relief and exhaustion. Fires that had struggled against darkness for months were finally helped by the natural return of sunlight. Animals were dragged from barns into weak pasture. Cabbages and roots grown rubbery in storehouses were replaced with first greens of spring. And as birds began their calls again, peasants lifted their eyes from muddy boots toward horizons filled with promise. Winter had not defeated them. It had scoured and tested, strengthening patience, frugality, and the bonds that tied neighbour to neighbour. And so, when we reflect upon the life of the medieval peasant enduring the coldest nights, we glimpse more than hardship. We find a rhythm composed of endurance, craft, faith, and fellowship. Their cottages were crude, their meals modest, their clothes coarse, yet inside those smoky huts was resilience that has kept their stories alive, even if unrecorded in scribes' fine ink. To imagine the scratch of straw bedding, the warmth of shared bodies beneath patched wool, the flavour of broth stirred endlessly on the fire. These are to know not only the darkness of winter, but the deep humanity that survived through it. They lived without comforts we take for granted, but they endured with a kind of steady dignity. Each thawed morning meant they had succeeded one more night, defying cold itself. Each song sung by the hearth was a victory over silence, each shared loaf, a triumph against despair. What remains to us, across centuries, is the quiet lesson they left behind, that survival rests not only in strength, but in cooperation, faith, and the stubborn will to see dawn after the longest night. So, as the embers of this story glow low, picture the medieval peasants tucked together in darkness, smoke curling above, frost-etching windows, hearts held steady by hope. Beyond the cold, beyond the hunger, lay the eternal promise of spring. Their lives whisper to us still, gently reminding that even the harshest winters can be endured. and the longest nights eventually give way to the light.